Assalomu alaykum. Bugun Markaziy Osiyo va dunyo nomli yangi dasturni boshladim. Bu dasturda chet ellik, turli sohadagi professor insonlar bilan intervyu olib boraman va ularning Markaziy Osiyo haqidagi fikrlarini birgalikda o'rganib boramiz. Bugun birinchi intervyu va men angliyalik siyosatshunos professor Uin Watson taklif qilganman. Uin Watson Osiyo davlatlari haqida ko'plab Osiyo davlatlarining siyosati haqida ko'plab ilmiy tadqiqotlar qilgan va tashqi yordam va rivojlanayotgan davlatlar nomli kitob yozgan. Kitobi haqida ham bugun so'rab o'tamiz. Videoni boshlashingizdan oldin ba'zi texnik kamchiliklar uchun uzr so'rayman va bu kamchiliklarni keyingi videolarda yo'qotib borishga harakat qilaman. Rahmat. Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for agreeing for the interview. Can you introduce yourself?
Okay, so my name is Professor Ian Watson, and I've been teaching at Azure GSIS for about 15 years now, so quite a long time. My main areas of study are international development and cooperation, specifically looking at Korean ODA, where I published journal work and a few books on this topic. My main area now is focused on Korea's role in trade in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN areas, and I've also been very interested in Korea's relationship with Central Asia, particularly geopolitically and geo-economically as well. So thank you for inviting me.
How important do you think the role of Central Asia countries in the world?
At the moment, over the last 20 or 30 years, it's clearly becoming more important. I would stress the role of China, China's infrastructure projects, the Belt and Road projects, which has really taken off in the last 5 or 10 years. And that clearly has a number of intended and unintended consequences for Central Asia, given that the Central Asian countries do share a lot of physical borders, and they all have different and diverse foreign policy objectives, particularly in relations with Russia and China and the US, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. So in my view, Central Asia is now becoming a key, emerging as a key region, which opens up a lot of questions regarding to what extent Central Asian countries want to cooperate together as a region, or whether they're quite happy cooperating individually or as a group with the wider regional powers. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well.
Thank you. Economic development. How successful has Uzbekistan been in development its economy beyond natural resources into manufacturing and services?
Well, I mean, according to the data, very successful. I mean, it's very clear over the last 5, 10, 15 years, GDP per capita and GNI per capita has risen. So I think at the moment the World Bank designates Uzbekistan as a middle income country. And I think that's a really good base now for Uzbekistan to take that next step forward. With a number of government plans. From what I can hear and read about Uzbekistan, the government is putting forward some 5-year plans, 10-year plans to reach high middle income status within a decade. So some of the data is quite extraordinary. So there's been a real takeoff with Uzbekistan. And I think what you can see is that this takeoff is not necessarily due to previous assumptions of the Uzbek economy. A lot of it is due to the increasing diversity within Uzbekistan, and I think there's now a link and a dynamic now between these two, which I think a lot of countries are watching.
Thank you. How to make Uzbekistan attractive to investors?
I think in a way the normal policies, so opening out to other countries, globalization, trade, freedom of trade, free barriers coming down. I think also the private sector seems to be quite an important area now for Uzbekistan. The government's focusing on that. And one thing that I find particularly intriguing is this role of natural resources, because the assumption is that Uzbekistan has relied a lot on primary commodities, natural resources. But what seems to be happening now is that the Uzbek government is wanting to protect these natural resources as an environmental issue and build the economy around that. So a lot of diversity with attracting foreign investment in. So a very classic globalization strategy, which I don't really think should surprise us. The big surprise for me is the natural resource question and the way that it's been mobilized and used for this.
Thank you. What role do political reforms play Uzbekistan's development prospects?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think there is a uniqueness to Uzbekistan given the geographical location, but I think we can see these patterns, and it seems to be the Uzbek government is trying to manage the specific policies which are unique to Uzbekistan, with this wider pressure to open up, to mobilize, to focus on the private sector, to focus on infrastructure, to focus on rural development, and also energy, the energy issue as well, which I think is generally a Central Asian question. So that's something, certainly when it comes to the pipelines, the oil, electricity, that is something that might actually bind the Central Asian countries together to share the natural resources on that and share the energy. And of course, that would be also intrinsically geopolitical because, of course, with Russia and China involved. So I think it's the trajectory, the choice, it seems to be where the situation that Uzbekistan finds itself in, because of its rapid economic development, is finding itself having to make choices that perhaps it hasn't had to make before. And that's an advantage, but that can also be a disadvantage as well for actually getting these policies through at an institutional level domestically within Uzbekistan.
Thank you. Coffee.
Okay.
Recently, I read this book, Why Nations Fail.
Yes.
I was surprised because it showed everything was due to political institution.
Right.
But it also depends on geographical location because how much democracy we achieve when we are located between Russia and China.
Yes.
Non-democratic countries.
Yes, exactly. I am quite skeptical of this focus on institutions. It seems very ahistorical. In other words, it's very abstract. There's a lot of talk about inclusivity, diversity. It's never really explained what these words actually mean anyway in different historical contexts. So I think there's a lot of bland explanation through looking at institutions and inclusivity, and I think it misses the concrete pressures on countries like Uzbekistan, surrounded by bigger powers, as Korea is very, very similar. And also because those surrounding powers are, as you say, autocratic and non-democratic. That's a lot of pressure on governments and states surrounded by these wider states. And I suppose you could also call China and Russia part of the BRIC, this whole BRIC development as well. So yes, institutions are good, clearly, but not enough. There's other factors involved here as well, and geography and geopolitics plays a massive part in that.
I agree. Therefore, if Uzbekistan can achieve democracy, it will encourage the rest of Central Asia to achieve democracy as well. Do you think so?
I think that I don't see why not. I think that's. I mean, I know within domestically, there's the politics of all this, but there's no reason. I can see no reason why, given not just that Central Asia is central, but Uzbekistan is central in Central Asia. It's kind of double centralization here. For that reason alone, I think there's a very good opportunity here for Uzbekistan to begin to almost export its own development model. And if that includes the question of democratization, then so be it. And I think there's a very much an analogy made here with Korea. I think the Uzbek government is very interested in what Korea is doing. It seems to be exactly the same process going through. So the Korea-Uzbek relationship could prove to be a really important one, not just in traditional trade or economics, but in terms of shared experience, of learning from each other, how to manage this process, given a democracy situation and also given the role of the rising powers around both countries.
Thank you. Currently, Uzbekistan is cooperating with Korea in many areas. What can you say about it?
I would see mainly infrastructure as the big one. There's a great interest in both countries with this question of environmental protection, but also mobilize the environment for economic development. So the kind of green growth development is quite an important one. Uzbekistan hasn't really been on that track as much as other states, but I think it's moving in that direction now. So it's looking at natural resources, not just to export for finance coming in, not just to protect, but to do both at the same time, to protect natural resources through the market and through economic development. And that's a model that Korea has been using for a while now, is exporting to many countries. So I think that natural resource issue is an important one for both countries.
Thank you. What role does Uzbekistan play in geographics of Central Asia, and how might its relationship with neighboring countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan influence regional stable and economic growth?
I think this is almost a generational issue for Uzbekistan, that the the classic understanding of Central Asia as a Cold War relationship, as a post-Cold War relationship. I think that is beginning to change now as political leadership moves through to the next generation. So I think all countries, with Uzbekistan pretty centrally located, have to make a decision about whether they are happy to perhaps have more integration with each other as a specific Central Asian region. At this stage, nothing like the European Union or anything like that, but the idea, or maybe where the European Economic Community was about 30 or 40 years ago, to generate that kind of economic cooperation, to see what happens from there. Political union might be more problematic. But this is a big decision, I think, that these countries have to make, whether they push for regionalisation amongst themselves, and that push would actually not frighten but worry China and Russia, because it's a sign that Central Asia is powerful enough and interested enough in perhaps breaking away and becoming much more as an independent region or independent sub-region. So the reaction of China and Russia will be absolutely key to that. So that's going to take a lot of institution building between the countries, but I think given the geopolitics at the moment between US, Russia and China, there may be a gap opening up here, but the Central Asian states say, look, we can redefine our regional identity, go beyond the post-Soviet identity, and maybe create some different regional organization with a specific regional identity for the next coming 20, 30 years.
Yeah, thank you. China is making huge investment in Central Asia countries. Many politicians in Uzbekistan say to be careful about this investment. What is your opinion?
I don't think there's anything wrong in that. I think any investment from any country overseas, you've got to be aware that there are strings attached to that. It's possible that in different areas which receive Chinese investment, Chinese ODA, there are certain political interests in all countries who are pro-China or anti-China. So I think a pragmatic approach might be useful, but I think it's very prudent for the Uzbek government and the interests involved just to keep an eye on what China is doing, trying to work out what's China's motivation here.
Yeah.
At the moment, it's infrastructure, and this is for China's interests. And you could make an argument to say if Uzbekistan benefits from that, then so be it. That's fine. But with China and other big powers, there are always strings attached. Sometimes not always visible at the time. So prudence, I think, would be a reasonable response to that. Yeah.
Thank you. How do you imagine Central Asia in next decades?
My view is that regionalisation is the key. I think it'll be much more integration. I think the governments will want to keep their national sovereignty. So it'll be regional integration, but based on sharing, pooling resources, but based on the principle of national sovereignty, very much like Southeast Asian nations and the ASEAN model. So a lot of integration, trade barriers coming down, but also very protective of national sovereignty. So my view is, given the patterns we're seeing around the world today, that could be something that in 10 or 20 years' time you'd see a very strong regional bloc within Central Asia, given that the world now is very much moving towards different regional blocs. Now, whether that regional bloc itself is independent or a part of a wider regional bloc, which is defined by Russia, China or the US, no one knows. But I think the integration issue is the key one for Uzbekistan at the moment.
Thank you. Professor, what are your thoughts on the increasing number of young generation in government in Uzbekistan and elsewhere in Central Asia?
Yeah, because that's sometimes these ages a bit artificial. So you could say, someone's over the age of 40, therefore they can't be a politician. But generally, I would say that if you look around the world today, there's some very young leaders of countries around, apart from the United States. There's definitely been a generation of kind of basically born in the 1980s, which to me sounds really young. And it makes a difference. That really does make a difference. Not just in terms of awareness of global events, but also in terms of how they understand left-wing politics or right-wing politics, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's that really matters, that the perception and the generations coming through. So the older generations, and there was I can't remember the name of the book written recently about this in Europe. So the first generation of post-World War II baby boomer generation, they grew up in the 1930s and remember the World War II, the rise of Hitler and so on, all that kind of thing. So that impacted their understandings of Europe when they became politicians. And now you have a generation of politicians who were in university at the end of the Cold War. So that's impacted their version, their understanding of reality. So it happens, there's kind of a time lag that comes through. So I think that can be very much underestimated in politics, and you can see the patterns of interest. So those who are brought up in wartime want to bring everyone together. Those who are brought up in a period of integration want to become more independent again. So it kind of goes through the system in these cycles. So that's very much a pattern we see now in global politics. Very young leaders of countries.
Yes.
So I think that's very significant, absolutely. And who knows? I mean, it does often happen, but you get leaders of the same generation who sometimes went to the same universities. They read the same books. They understand each other, which is more difficult when you have a leader who's 80 and a leader who's 35. They basically have nothing in common whatsoever in terms of their life experience. So I think that really matters. Yeah, absolutely.
Professor, in what area should Uzbekistan not lag behind in the future?
I'm going to sound really boring here, but it's going to be AI and technology and that kind of stuff, and the blockchain thing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think any country can break it, can avoid that. So it's certainly not going to be manufacturing and that kind of industry. It's going to be in the old-fashioned terms, tertiary sector, service sector industry, education, but maybe not traditional education, different kinds of education. I know all the students now do ChatGPT and all that kind of stuff. So even the old model of teaching is beginning to change a little bit. But I think that makes students much more creative. So much more individually based, as we talked about earlier, kind of creating one's own business, reacting to again a generational question. But for me, the AI is going to be absolutely. I mean, it's not a surprise. Really.
For example,
just everywhere. Yeah.
DeepSeek broke
And exactly
American
the DeepSeek thing. So there you go. So when you talked about the Chinese influence, the Belt and Road, I mean the next level from that is the DeepSeek thing. Yeah, so that's the next one, which is China all over, and they kept that very quiet, but now it's out there, and not just in terms of using that technology, but also in old-fashioned terms, understanding that technology to protect the security of the country. Okay, so and it's a cybersecurity question. So you need to harness that technology, but aware of dangers of that technology. So clearly, that's going to be it for the next 10 or 20 years. But paradoxically, you've got all the latest technology like the blockchains and AI and so on. But at the end of the day, it also comes back to geography. What resources do you have? Do you have gas? Do you have oil? How do you keep lights on? How do you keep the homes warm? How do you keep the electricity flowing so you can actually have access to this technology and keep the plugs working? So it's again, a lot of people look at politics in a very complicated way, but in that way it's very basic. So you get this kind of strange paradox where you have all the latest tech, but at the end of the day you need the electricity on, otherwise it's not going to work, which is pretty basic natural resource stuff. But the thing that does is in the middle, that middle bit with the education sector, with the manufacturing sector, with the heavy industry sector, they're a little bit more squeezed now. So it's kind of that this middle area in between is now opening up for opportunity, but it can also be very problematic for people who perhaps have careers or jobs in these areas, and they could be in serious trouble economically. And I think a lot of states are going to have to seriously prepare for that. We're seeing this in Europe at the moment. That group in the middle is being very, very squeezed. So we'll see what happens. But I would say, yeah, that the AI thing is really shocked a lot of people what's happening there.
Professor, what can Uzbekistan learn from other countries in the region or beyond that have successfully navigated similar challenges in terms of economic transaction and development?
The examples I've given, ASEAN would be an example, integration, Korea would be an example. So learning about kind of managing the great powers, opening out to trade. The only difference now, I would say, for countries going through this process is that we are looking at a model and a wider sense of globalization in a very different context now than it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So the opportunities that Korea had and other middle income countries had are probably not as strong now for Uzbekistan. So I've noticed on looking at Uzbekistan, there's still very much an emphasis on self-sufficiency and self-reliance. But yes, engage with globalization, engage with these processes, but I think governments now need to be more aware that globalization could be stopped next week or the week after because of the geopolitics involved. So, and that's why the natural resource issue is really important for Uzbekistan, to protect those natural resources and to harness them domestically, but also to be aware that the regional process is a trans-regional process, is a regional process, but also within regions there are small groupings of states. So I think the pattern is emerging, but self-sufficiency is I think really important now, given that trade barriers are beginning to go up around the world. And if self-sufficiency occurs in a regional grouping of 5 or 6 nations, that was seen very much an ideal number to do that. And I think personally, Uzbekistan is right in the centre of that. So real opportunity to move on as the next generation comes through. Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.